It's Newsweek On Air for the week of August 3rd. I'm Warren Levinson of the Associated Press.
And I'm David Alpern of Newsweek.
Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and established footholds in the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula. At the same time, Syrian forces attacked the Golan Heights, a vantage point that commands Israeli settlements in the valleys below.
Correspondent Morgan Beatty describing the start of the 1973 Yom Kippur War on the highest holy day of the year for Jews. Beyond bloodshed in the Middle East, it meant a potential confrontation between the two superpowers, Moscow supporting the Arab states and the United States behind Israel. That dramatic development and the final frenzied U.S. pullout from Vietnam 2 years later are the subjects of yet another memoir by Dr. Henry Kissinger. It's called Crisis, the anatomy of two major foreign policy crises, based on the record of Henry Kissinger's hitherto secret telephone conversations.
The conversations involve Presidents Nixon and Ford, their closest aides, officials of the Soviet Union, and various other nations. Newsweek excerpts Crisis in this week's issue, focused on the Yom Kippur War. We have Dr. Kissinger with us to talk about it. Why now? Why look again at these crises 30 years later?
The utility is that it shows how crises are actually handled hour by hour. And there is a certain similarity to crises as they occur, in the sense that the government has to find out what is going on. It has to define a sense of direction for itself. It has to relate that to the view of other countries, and it then has to attempt to create rewards and penalties to bring its objectives about.
These are your conversations, of course, but I wonder how it felt to be plunged back into these two crises again. Was it a purely scholarly exercise or a bit emotional as well?
Well, it certainly brought to life many dramatic experiences, and it had that emotional side.
Were there some things said by you or by others that you'd forgotten about after all these years and provided a bit of surprise as you worked on this? Did you find yourself even second-guessing yourself at times and saying, oh, maybe I should have said that instead of this?
It wasn't so much a question of second-guessing myself. I had forgotten, I had remembered the main events, but I had forgotten that that all the various consultations one engaged in and all the various influences that were being brought to bear on these issues.
It's only 30 years since this, and yet I was struck reading this by how much of a relic of the bipolar world these conversations are. There's war in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Egyptians, and yet a lot of the conversation between yourself and Dobrynin or Vorontsov has to do with, well, we cannot let whatever happens here, we cannot let this torpedo the bridges that we've built between the United States and the Soviet Union.
They're two separate things. One is the relations between the great powers. The second is the issues in the Middle East itself, and those have practically not changed in the last 30 years. Our attitude was not, no matter what happens, we have to prevent a strain of in relations. Our view was that we must avoid a nuclear war. And when the Soviets challenged us, we went on military alert. But we did have as a major objective the preservation of peace and to make progress on the Middle East peace negotiations.
Another leitmotif that runs through this Newsweek excerpt on the Yom Kippur War is domestic political concern, how U.S. diplomacy might help President Nixon counter the Watergate scandal, for example, how that diplomacy might affect American voting constituencies. Did you find that a bigger problem then than is usual for U.S. foreign policymakers?
The excerpt is bound to be condensed. If you read the entire book, you will find that played a relatively small role, the impact of the domestic pressure groups. What did play a role was the general attitude in the country as a result of Watergate, which created problems of credibility.
Did you find the White House being distracted by not only Watergate, but at that time, at the time of this war, the negotiation over the resignation of Spiro Agnew was going on?
Spiro Agnew resigned in the middle of this war. During the first week of this war, the Watergate crisis came to a head at the end of the second week of the war. And our fear was that it would impair our ability to conduct diplomacy with other countries who might think that the United States could not carry out whatever agreements it made or whatever pledges it gave.
In the middle of all this, you won the Nobel Peace Prize. What was that like?
Well, I was at a meeting in the Situation Room in the White House, and somebody brought in a press ticker that I had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Normally, candidates for the Nobel Peace Prize know that they're candidates. I did not know I was a candidate and I was even being considered. So, at first, I thought it was somebody was playing some sort of a joke on me. But then we got more material, and that is, of course, the greatest honor that a practicing statesman can have.
There are some wonderfully human moments in these transcripts, some poignant, some funny. A poignant one is in relation to the Nobel Peace Prize. Nixon had his eye on it, to a degree his heart set on it, though of course the fighting went on for 2 more years, and there are conversations between the two of you suggesting that he still wants to be part of it, and indeed you agree.
I think that Nixon conducted himself with enormous grace. And it would be only natural that the president gets the prize and not his advisor.
We would be remiss if we didn't ask you what the lessons for today are from your efforts in 1973 that might be applied in the peace process, which, as you say, deals with facts on the ground that haven't changed much.
I think we are in especially the situation has some analogy now. At the end of the 73 war, the United States emerged as having dominated the situation because we sent a lot of supplies, and we were asked by both parties to be the principal mediator, the only mediator. Now, at the end of the Middle East, the Iraq conflict, the United States again has emerged in a leading position in the Middle East. And the problems of what borders Israel should have and what the Arab nations will accept, which was the issue in 73, and with which we solved with respect to Egypt, but which is now in front of us with respect to the Palestinians. One has to reach a point where both sides think it is in their interest to conclude an agreement rather than continue warfare. And we had reached that point, and I think it is mentioned in one of the excerpts with respect to Egypt and Israel, and now that has to be attempted to be applied to Israel and the Palestinians.
Henry Kissinger's latest book is called Crisis, The Anatomy of Two Major Foreign Policy Crises, based on the record of Henry Kissinger's hitherto secret telephone conversations.
We're back with Newsweek On Air. I'm David Alpern of Newsweek.
I'm Warren Levinson of AP Network News.
Perhaps the most important goal any administration can set itself is to work for a world in which the award will become irrelevant, because peace will have become so normal and so much taken for granted that no awards for it will have to be given.
Henry Kissinger acknowledging his 1973 Nobel Peace Prize. He's bargained with some of the world's most powerful men, partied with some of its most beautiful women, and moved himself ever forward with a brilliant blend of private politicking and public self-promotion. Rarely has an American diplomat and foreign policy strategist been as highly regarded and as viciously reviled as the former Secretary of State.
A new biography of Kissinger recalls his brilliance as a conceptualizer and negotiator, the breakthrough with China, détente with the Soviet Union, shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, but it also details compulsive egotism, sycophancy, and duplicity.
The author is Walter Isaacson, assistant managing editor of a magazine called Time. That's the one that didn't think Hurricane Andrew was worth a cover story last week. But corporate rivalries aside, Walter is an old friend and neighbor of mine. I'm delighted to have him on the line with us now. Welcome to Newsweek On Air.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
Kissinger was born to an Orthodox Jewish family in Bavaria and developed what you call that odd mixture of ego and insecurity that can come from growing up smart and persecuted. How did that affect the way he worked his way up the ladder of power after he got to the United States?
Well, when he started getting into power, he was very domineering towards his subordinates. He was kind of devious with his peers, and he was rather sycophantish with his superiors. And as Les Gelb, the New York Times columnist, once said, and Les was at Harvard with him and said it way back then, that's a typical product of an authoritarian background.
He attached himself to a number of powerful patrons in the Army, at Harvard, and in New York. Talk about some of those.
When he was in the Army, he was just a private. He had been drafted and sent down to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. And a sergeant named Fritz Kramer was supposed to give a description of why they were fighting the war. And Fritz Kramer was an immigrant from Prussia, not Jewish, but he had left Germany because he hated Hitler. And he was giving a description of the war, and Kissinger was mightily impressed, and he wrote a fan letter, said, "Dear Sergeant Kramer, this is the way it should be done." Well, Kramer took him under wing, and instead of being in the infantry, he brought Kissinger along and brought him into the counterintelligence corps. And he was Kissinger's first patron, a very powerful, larger-than-life, egotistical man who became both an intellectual patron and one who helped along Kissinger's career. Ever since then, Kissinger liked to attach himself to powerful, larger-than-life characters. One of them was Professor William Yandell Elliott at Harvard, a grand professor of the old school. And then, of course, Nelson Rockefeller, and finally, Richard Nixon.
Of course, Kissinger's ascension to Secretary of State was not without its insults. He wasn't even invited to the formal announcement by Richard Nixon, and he was distracted when he tried to follow it on TV. Tell us that story.
Yeah, it's great. In fact, a very nice review in Newsweek leads with that anecdote. What happened was Nixon did not want to make Kissinger Secretary of State. He was jealous of Kissinger. Kissinger was at this point National Security Advisor and had done the opening to China, the secret Paris Peace Accords, had become very, very famous. And Nixon, who was president, thought that Kissinger was stealing all of his thunder, that Kissinger was getting all of the credit. But of course, Watergate was just starting to brew, and he knew that he couldn't afford to either fire Kissinger or not make him Secretary of State when William Rogers resigned that position. So he grudgingly made Kissinger Secretary of State. He made the announcement heaping effusive praise on William Rogers, who had done a very poor job as Secretary of State, very honorable man, but had not done a great job as Secretary of State, and then spent only one sentence saying, well, Dr. Kissinger's qualifications are well known to you. And then just at that moment, Kissinger got a phone call from Liv Ullmann, the actress, and said, well, wait, I'm about to be, because he wasn't invited to Kissinger was not even invited to the press conference, so he was watching it on TV. So Liv Ullmann called him, and Kissinger said, well, wait, he's about to announce that I'm going to be Secretary of State, but it lasted only one sentence, and he missed the announcement.
And what does Nixon really think of Kissinger? I mean, that speaks volumes, of course, of what he does.
Well, Nixon was resentful of Kissinger and very impressed with Kissinger's mind. He had a great respect for Kissinger's brilliance as a foreign policy conceptualizer. But he was very wary of Kissinger's personality. And one thing I found in the Nixon archives, which are a great trove of material for historians who want to go back, are all of the handwritten notes that Haldeman and Ehrlichman took at the meetings, because Nixon would just ramble on, and Haldeman and Ehrlichman would sit there and fill up yellow legal pads filled with all of these ramblings. And at one point in 1971, a couple years after they got into office, Nixon is insisting that somebody tell Henry Kissinger that he needs psychiatric help, or he's going to be fired if he doesn't get psychiatric help. And of course, nobody wanted to tell Kissinger that, but Kissinger had gone through a lot of tantrums, was getting very angry, was kind of jealous of Secretary of State Rogers at that point, and Nixon just thought that Kissinger needed help.
Well, you've said that Kissinger attached himself to Nixon at the end of a line of many. What did Kissinger really think about Nixon and say about him behind his back?
Well, to some extent, he respected Nixon's courage and ability to conceptualize foreign policy. However, behind his back, he tried to imply, and there was some truth to it, that Nixon was drunk at times, was kind of a madman, a guy who was president who was prone to having fantasies about the use of power. And Kissinger liked to imply to both people in Congress and certainly the aides in the White House that he was the only person standing between the person he called that madman, that's what he called Nixon sometime, or that drunken fool, or that maniac, and peace, and you know, that Nixon might drop the bomb at any moment if Kissinger weren't around. So behind his back, he used to belittle Nixon quite savagely.
You've got any word yet on Kissinger's reaction to the book?
I think he hates the book but likes the title.
Thanks a lot. We've been talking about Henry Kissinger, diplomat and media star. We've been talking with Walter Isaacson, author of Kissinger, a biography. He's in East Hampton, New York. Thanks again.